Salam, shalom, and peace. I'm Azra Hussain, the co-founder and president of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, also known as ISBA or ISBA. Welcome to this month's Ilm Circle. Our guest tonight is Mufti Didmar Faya, who is currently the Imam of the United Islamic Center of Arizona in Glendale, Arizona. He's the founder and director of the Greenway Academy, which is an Islamic school co-located with the United Islamic Center of Arizona, and the founder and director of two Islamic centers in Mexico, one in the state of Sonora and the other in the state of Durango. He's a religious and spiritual advisor for Naqshbandiya Foundation for Islamic Education, where he delivers a monthly address on topics relating to Islamic spirituality, and he's also an instructor at Medina Institute USA in Atlanta. He particularly enjoys training students in the art of Quranic recitation and is the founder of Arizona's annual Quran competition. He's a published author in both English and Albanian. He is fluent in Albanian, English, Arabic, and Turkish. Please welcome Mufti Didmar Faya.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the beneficent, all praise belongs to Him. I ask Him to send His peace and His blessings upon His beloved Prophet Muhammad, His family members, His brethren among the prophets and messengers who were sent to the humankind, and all of those, the family members of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and all of those who followed his way of life. Let me greet you with the greetings of Islam. Assalamu alaikum. May the peace be upon you, the peace of God. And I am very happy and glad to be a part of this program organized by Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. And I thank from the bottom of my heart Sister Azra, who does an amazing job here in Arizona and outside as well when it comes to promote the true Islamic teachings and the values that we have as Muslims to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And may God give her strength and strengthen her organization as well, so they can carry on with the amazing work that they have been doing in the future as well, inshallah. I was asked to talk about an important subject, or I would call it a discipline as well, and that is tasawwuf. It can be translated as mysticism or Sufism sometimes, but in the Arabic language, the word for this discipline is called tasawwuf. We're going to talk about where did this start and how it started, why it started. We're going to try to answer these questions. And then later on, we'll get into the history, in particularly those authors who wrote initial books on Sufism, on Islamic mysticism. And I'm going to pretty much stay there. I'm going to focus on the early writers and early masters of Sufism. And then we may say a few words quickly about the development of Sufism, but that's where my focus is going to be. And I'm going to introduce you some of the books that were written on this discipline. And I will close it by mentioning to you why Sufism was important back then, it remains important, and it will always remain important as long as the human life exists on this earth. Now, there are many definitions when it comes to Sufism or Tasawwuf, actually, in the Arabic language. And there are, as a matter of fact, there are hundreds and if not even thousands of those, not necessarily definitions, but scholars or learned people who have talked about the meaning and where it came from. It's important, though, to recognize the fact that during the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, there were a number of his companions who used to live in the mosque of the Prophet. And these were called Ahl Sufa, the people of Suf. Now, Suf in the Arabic language It means wool. Why were they called the people of the wool? Because they used to carry on clothes made of wool. This is because of poverty. They didn't have enough clothes to change, and they didn't have other places where they can just go, spend their daytime, come back, eat, go back again, sleep in their own houses like most of the people had during that time. So these were individuals, these were the companions of the Prophet, who some of them, as a matter of fact, decided to leave the normal lifestyle and dedicate themselves to the teachings of Islam, dedicate their time to learning about the statements of the Prophet, record them, either memorize them or write them down, and distribute that knowledge to the other people. So they would be teaching the other people the verses of the Quran and the statements of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. These were devout individuals. They were very, very devout individuals. And some of the people who have narrated the statements of Prophet Muhammad, for example, Abu Huraira or Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, these are a few names among those who are the most well-known companions of the Prophet who narrated the hadith the most among his companions. So they were, overall, we can say that they were very well engaged with knowledge, either learning it or teaching it to the others, but at the same time implementing it on their daily lives as well. So we can also say that they were very righteous people and they were very knowledgeable people at the same time. Now, um, since they wore that kind of cloth, which is made of wool, they were called the people of Suf, or the people of this type of clothes that they were wearing. And it became as a custom among the later on Sufis who followed the path of mysticism and elevation, spiritual elevations. It became as I said, as a custom to wear clothes made of wool like that. Um, some others they say that this mysticism used to exist as a discipline before Muslims as well. So Muslims, when Islam came, they simply followed this mysticism that it existed already in Christianity, in Hinduism, Buddhism, in other religions as well. So they adopted that in Islam as well. Anyways, like I said, there are so many ideas out there, but the first fact that I just mentioned to you, it is well known in our books, in the Islamic books, that these companions used to live like that. These were mystics on their own, without declaring themselves as mystics, without really establishing an association or an organization of mysticism. They were living mystics of that time. Anyways, later on we see in the Islamic world, as the religion started being spread in different parts of the world, it went to Persia, it went to Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire at that time, in Damascus, in Kufa, Baghdad, um, of course Mecca and Medina, Egypt, Yemen, south of Arabia. So it started getting spread pretty much in the main parts of the world that was known back then at that time. And as they started spreading, Muslims, they became very powerful when it comes to government, and they started having some good leaders, but also some bad leaders as well. And some of these bad leaders, they became kind of dictators. They became, they would tell people you have to believe on certain ways. For example, when it comes to Aqidah, when it comes to the Islamic creed, they were imposing upon people to believe on certain, I don't want to call them theories, but certain beliefs that nowadays they're not the mainstream beliefs of the Islamic creed or Islamic theology. So they were emphasizing, and they were making people believe. Otherwise, they would go to jail. And we have examples of great scholars of this tradition who ended up being in jail because they refused to agree um, with the way how these rulers they were imposing upon people and upon the scholars. So now, again, there were not all of them, but there were many of them, especially from the Umayyads and later on with the Abbasids, the same thing. These were the two main, um, I would say, not necessarily empires, but the leading governments at that time. There were kings for sure, kingdoms, if you want to call them that way too, that's fine. Um, they call themselves as leaders of the believers, the khulafa, as a matter of fact, the leaders of the believers at that time. And these scholars, some of the scholars, they said, we're not going to follow what they say, but at the same time, we're not gonna go head to head and start rejecting what they're saying, because otherwise, if we all start getting in prison and we start getting killed, then who's going to remain here? What's going to be in the future? So they decided to withdraw completely from politics and to withdraw from the typical lifestyle that used to take place in regards. I'm not talking about withdraw completely from life, but withdraw from public eyes, pretty much. And they decided to live more an isolated life, and they started emphasizing a lot on the idea of zuhud, which is kind of a withdrawal, or wara, which is the withdrawal from the public eyes and public gatherings and political conversation, and the list goes on and on. Now, when they withdraw, they started focusing more on those ideas, or not necessarily ideas, practices that were emphasized on the Quran and the statements of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they became masters of these practices. And as they started mastering them very well, they saw an upliftment. They saw spiritual upliftment, and many of them they started to write about these experiences that they were having. Someone may ask, what kind of experience is this? What are they going through? Well, they started understanding life um, in different ways. We may say that things or ideas or experiences that normal people were not able to experience, these individuals, because they exercised their spiritual states and they mastered, they had full control over their egos as well, and they started seeing things in a different way. They would not get upset right away from things that normally people would get upset. They would not become very joyful right away for something that normally people would get joyful right away. They started feeling that proximity with God and His presence in their hearts more than other individuals. So, as I said, that the list goes on, and there are so many other practices that they did, but I just gave you a few of them so you can have an understanding. But this really elevated them. And as I said, they started writing about certain aspects of these rituals. And now, as they were going through this, we're talking about now a few hundred years after the passing away of Prophet Muhammad. So we're talking about in the 800s, we're talking about 900s, and probably early 11th century. And as a matter of fact, these were the years when also knowledge at the same time started flourishing, Islamic knowledge all over the Muslim world. Um, and you had great imams, for example, who um, were leaders in Islamic jurisprudence, like Imam Abu Hanifa in Kufa, or Imam Malik in Medina. These were the foundations of the Islamic schools, the four main Islamic schools, or Imam al-Shafi'i, or Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So at the same time, we see that there is a rising also of the Sufis, the early Sufis, um, And among these names, I would mention is Abdullah bin Mubarak, a very famous wali, a very famous. We call them friends of God, not literally in a literal sense, but they were very close to God, and they achieved a nearness with God, and they earned this title by people, of course. Otherwise, they would not call themselves were friends of God. But God refers to them in the Quran, awliya Allah. You know, these are the friends, the very close, those who achieve that proximity with God, individuals. So you have Abdullah bin Mubarak, you have others like, for example, Junaid al-Baghdadi, Ibrahim bin Adham, and then later on you have some other uh, individuals who, unfortunately, they because the Islamic creed started developing more and more, they also thought that they are developing in mysticism, and as a result of that wrong understanding of development, some of these so-called individuals, so-called Sufi masters, they started mentioning that we don't have to necessarily follow the rituals of Islam. We don't have to pretty much pray. And as many of you know, that prayer 5 times a day is mandatory for Muslims. So they said, well, this is mandatory for those who are trying to reach those states, those spiritual states. But for us, these are not mandatory because we have passed those states. We have already achieved that nearness with God. We have already overcome our egos, ourselves, ambitions. And as a result, they ended up confusing a lot of people. And a lot of scholars at that time, they rose against them and they said, this is not Islam. Um, but at the same time, you had some other Sufi masters who started writing books at that time. And I'm talking about the 900s approximately here, when they said, you know what, that is not the form of Sufism that we are um, applying. That's not the form of Sufism that we're following. That is a wrong way of doing things. But the right Sufism is one, two, three, four. So they started writing books on what is the true Sufism. And when you go back to these teachings, when you go back to these early writings on Tasawwuf or Sufism, you will see that the main verse from the Quran that many of these great early classical scholars they refer to is a verse from Surah Al-A'la, from the last part of the Quran. And as a matter of fact, this is one of the last verses of this surah that says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى. Indeed, the person who purifies himself or herself has attained success. So again, when you purify yourself, you are attaining success, meaning purifying yourself from sins, purifying yourself from ambitions, desires, and we're not talking about positive desires, but those desires that will lead the person to become a victim of this materialistic world. Those kind of desires we're talking about here. So that's what the verse is saying, that the person who purifies himself or herself has attained success. And this is, again, like I said, this is like the theme verse of the Quran that you would find it in so many of these books written on Tasawwuf. So I just mentioned to you a few names, but the list goes on and on. There are so many of these masters and well known, you know, they're not just uh, written there in the history books, but there are so many of them that we don't have time to go through all of those names right now. But I'm gonna go through a few of them, and I already mentioned a few of them to you already. So, and I'll introduce you also with their books. What are those books that they have written at that time? One of them And I'm not going chronologically here. I'm just, as I said, we're talking about a few hundred years in the 900s, probably late 800s, 900s, and early 11th century. One of the books that was written, it was from Imam al-Qushayri, Al-Risala fi al-Tasawwuf, the epistles of Sufism, or principles of Sufism, as it is translated in this book right here. This is a great book. Probably those who didn't have a chance to see it, they will see the video later on recorded, or those who don't have a chance to write them down or take a picture, they can go back to the video. Hopefully it will be available soon, and they can either download them from internet if they are available, or maybe purchase them. So Principles of Sufism, this is an amazing book that was written during that time by Imam al-Qushayri. And Imam al-Qushayri, the beautiful thing about him and many other scholars like him is that these were not just masters of this particular discipline, which is Islamic mysticism, but they became masters of other disciplines as well, like, for example, hadith or tafsir. Hadith is the narrations of the Prophet, and it's a special or specific discipline on these narrations of the Prophet for those who are not familiar with the word hadith or hadith. So he became a master of that discipline. And as I said, tafsir is the Quranic exegesis or the interpretation of the Quran. Um, he became very well known on that as well. And then you have other individuals like Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi from Andalusia at that time. And this is the book that is translated in English. Most of these books are translated in English. So this is the Basils of Wisdom, Fusus al-Hikam, very well known book uh, around the Islamic world. And then you have Imam Ghazali, who was also a very well known scholar, maybe not from the early scholars. He lived in the 11th century, but his Ihya Ulumuddin, the very famous book, became well studied throughout the Muslim world at that time. So one of his amazing books on Tasawwuf itself is called Al-Ghazali's Path to Sufism, translated in the English language right here, uh, which is his deliverance from error, Munqidh min al-Dalal in the Arabic language. This is also another excellent book. And then we have Kitab al-Luma, which is very famous as well. Again, talks about those practices, the right practices, um, and criticizing some wrong practices at that time that people, they were doing them in the name of Sufism. So you have here Kitab al-Luma fi Tasawwuf. This is from Abu Nasir Sarraj al-Tusi, very famous as well. This is in both languages. It's in Arabic, Kitab al-Luma fi Tasawwuf, and you have it in the English language as well. It's an early translation in the English language, probably early 900s, early 1900s. And then you have the Revelation of the Veiled, Kashf al-Mahjub. This is also a very famous book of Imam al-Hujuri. You have that available online as well. Again, like I said, um, from the early scholars on Tasawwuf. And as I said, many of these great masters of Sufism, they wrote in different disciplines as well. Like you had Imam al-Qushayri, who wrote on Hadith, and he narrated Hadith, as a matter of fact. He is one of the famous narrators of Hadith, but he's also a good scholar in Islamic exegesis. And unfortunately, I don't have the translation of his tafsir in the English language, but I do have this one, Tafsir al-Qushayri, Lataif al-Isharat, very famous book. Um, it is in English for sure. They have translated, and it is available on PDF online. This is one of my favorite ones for sure, Tafsir al-Qushayri, Lataif al-Isharat. Um, and also you have from the early tafsir books, as I said, on Tasawwuf, you have Tafsir Tustari. Imam Tustari, Abdullah Sahal Tustari, he was very famous for exegesis, for the Quranic exegesis. So um, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is also among those who wrote on the Quranic exegesis. I mean, there are thousands of scholars who wrote on the Quranic exegesis, but what makes these scholars special writing in this science is that they approach the Quran in a different way. They did not ignore those verses where there is a command or where there is a prohibition, but they would go beyond the rules, because the Quran has so many rules about fasting, prayers, charity, and so on and so forth. So they went beyond those and they mentioned what is the esoteric, right? The esoteric part of those verses, or the batini meaning, the inner meaning of these verses, without necessarily rejecting the outer meaning. So they focus on the inner meaning, and there are certain words that they use. For example, haqa'iq. You would see that in the tafsir of Imam Ja'far. Haqa'iq, these are the realities. They would, based on their experiences, their spiritual experiences, they would come up with these realities, and they would say, this is the reality that is highlighted in this verse right here. Or another word for it would be ishara. Ishara is um, an indication. It's like a sign. If you translate it, a rough translation would be a sign or allegorical interpretation of certain verses of the Quran. So this allegorical interpretation is very beneficial because it doesn't give you just the outer meaning of the verse, but it gives you that inner meaning of the verse as well. For example, let's just go very quickly and mention an example where God would say to Musa alayhi salam, to Moses, O Moses, you are in a sacred valley called Tuwa. Therefore, take off your shoes, your na'alain, your sandals, however you want to translate them. And now, these scholars, they don't deny the reality that Moses was literally asked to take off his sandals or shoes, but the allegorical interpretation of this verse is that the right shoe indicates the, this world, and the left shoe indicates the hereafter as well. So as you're coming to me, as you are getting ready to receive my revelation, as you're getting ready to receive the guidance that I'm about to give you for your nation, for the Jewish people, I want you to come to me as you are, without thinking about this world and without thinking about the other world. So leave everything behind you and just come to me as you are. So again, without denying, because there were, I say without denying because there were some um, scholars who wrote uh, exegesis. Like I said, there were thousands of scholars who wrote the exegesis on Quran as scholars. They did the exegesis of Bible and so many other revelations that came down, and other books as well. They don't necessarily have to be divinely inspired. Or so. The thing, what happened was the fact that, they got lost and they completely started rejecting. And we have instances in our Islamic history where you had even sects where they started rejecting completely the Zahiri, uh, or the outer aspect of the interpretation of the verse. Right? So they started rejecting that, and or not necessarily get engaged with the outer meaning of the verse. Maybe not reject, but sometimes they would not even pay attention to implement what the verse was saying, and that's very important. So they started focusing more on the inner meaning of the verse. Islam is a religion, as a matter of fact, that highlights both the formal side of the religion, also the spiritual side of it. They go together. So these were some of the scholars, as I said, Sahel Tustari here, Imam Hushairi, and so many others who wrote amazing books at that time. There is one book also written by Fariduddin Attar. This is the English translation of it. Let me see if I can get you this one right here. So it's called Memorial of God's Friends. And what he did is he compiled the lives of these early Sufi masters in this book, and he gives us the best memories and the best teachings of these truly inspired and amazing masters of the early Sufi discipline. And he himself was in the 1200s, so he covered that very early part of Tasawwuf. And in his book, for example, I would like to mention to you when he talks about one of the great masters called Ma'ruf al-Karhi. He was in Iraq, he lived in Iraq, and there is there are some of the sayings of him, and he says here, for example, among from the sayings of Ma'ruf is this: the mark of the Lord's displeasure towards someone is that he distracts him with the affairs of the self, with something that is of no use to him. I'll read it again. The mark of the Lord's displeasure towards someone, if you want to know if God is not pleased with you or with someone else, look how he distracts that person with the affairs of the self. So it's all about me, 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 like fulfilling the passions, as I said earlier, being strongly connected with materialism. And then and then he says, with something, I mean, that is something which is no use to that person. Um, and among, for example, he mentions these karamat. Karamat are called miracles that God gave to these individuals who were uplifted spiritually. So among those you have those miracles, you have a recording here where he says it is related that Ma'ruf had an uncle who was governor of the city. One day he was passing by some ruined buildings, and he saw Ma'ruf sitting there eating and sharing his bowl with a dog. So imagine some ruined buildings. He's just sitting there. So Ma'ruf now was a famous scholar, right, and a person of spirituality, and he had followers and all that. And then all of a sudden, his own uncle, he sees him just sitting there in those ruined buildings and feeding a dog, like not just feeding a dog, but sitting and the dog next to him, and he's just eating one morsel, putting in his own mouth, and then giving food to the dog as well. And then upon seeing this, his own uncle said, "Aren't you ashamed to be eating with a dog?" He's talking based on his own experience being the governor, right? And then Maruf answered, "It is out of shame that I'm feeding the dog. So it is out of humbleness that I'm doing such an action." Then he raised his head and called a bird from the sky. The bird came down and perched on his hand and covered its eyes and face with its wings. I want you to imagine that the bird doing that. Everything Maruf said is ashamed before one who is ashamed before mighty and glorious Lord. So again, you have a bird who is coming right in front of him, in front of Maruf, and he is covering his own eyes and the head with his own wings. And you have the uncle there who is witnessing this, and he says that everything is shamed, or everything humbles himself or herself in front of humble people. So he considered himself humble, and he saw the action of the bird, as a sign of humbleness in front of him. So, as I mentioned, these were individuals who God gave them the ability to perform miracles. However, they didn't go out there and tell the people that we are people who perform miracles, and anybody who wants to see miracles, they can come over here and they can see. As a matter of fact, they preserve these miracles that God has given them. Unlike many other people nowadays who go out there and they're looking to perform miracles. And as a matter of fact, they measure their faith with the number of miracles that they're going to witness. So they're always looking to prove that they have a sound faith. What is going to be the number of the miracles that I'm going to perform or I'm going to witness? And they are in search of those miracles, and that shouldn't be the way. That shouldn't be the case. Unfortunately, it does exist in some traditions. But let me also introduce to you right now this book as well, and then we're going to conclude it. This is also another book. It's called Early Islamic Mysticism, as you can see it right there, written by or edited by Michael Sales. And it's a very good book because it talks about the early part of the Islamic mysticism or the tasawwuf. So it covers many names that I left out today because I just don't have time to go over all of them. But we did mention males here, many of them, but we also have uh, Sheikh Al Adawiya, who was very well known, and she was also one of the masters who produced many other masters as well. She was the spiritual lead for so many other individuals as well that benefited from her. Um, but this is very close to me, I mean, close to my heart, this particular discipline and the teachings of Tasawwuf. And I can go on and mention to you many other things, but I also recognize that this is more an introduction class or a session for people to understand what Tasawwuf is and what happens. So, at the end, I'm just going to wrap it up by saying that Sufism is not really uh, experienced by simply reading about Sufism or simply reading the stories of those masters and getting inspired or listening to a simple lecture like this one. Sufism is about learning and putting that to work. Sufism starts, as a matter of fact, by implementing all the commands that we are obligated to perform that are found in the Quran and in the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Otherwise, leaving behind Quran and leaving behind the words of Prophet, peace be upon him, that is not Sufism. Anybody who neglects that part and focuses and says that I'm a Sufi, I'm a mystic, Islamic mystic, by doing certain rituals or by simply reading certain books and by dressing in a particular way and feeling that he's a Sufi, that person has nothing to do in reality with the Islamic spirituality. Nothing. So first it comes the Sharia, first it comes the Islamic practices. They need to be implemented, and then a person, as a result of that practice, he gets closer to God by um, start doing some other uh, acts of worship that are not necessarily considered to be mandatory. For example, praying later on at night or mentioning the name of God a lot during the day and night. These are practices that are recommended. Prophet did them, however, they're not obligatory for Muslims to follow. And we have a beautiful statement of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he says that the servant of God draws near to me by fulfilling those commands that I have commanded him or her. But then later on, that person becomes loved to me. So I love that person. When? When that person starts fulfilling those other acts of worship that I did not necessarily command him to do, but I have recommended him to do. Then that person becomes beloved to me. And when that person becomes beloved to me, then I become his ear that he sees with. I become his hand that he touches with. I become his feet, his ear, his feet that he walks with, and so on. So you can see here that a person can get into Sufism, um, or Sufism pretty much is about fulfilling, right? Passing the stage of requirements and then going into the other stage or the other state where a person starts implementing those things that are recommended. And the better the person gets into those practices, the closer and the more beloved to God that person becomes. And I also wanted to mention to you that Sufism, when we say Sufism in general, um, there are many other disciplines without, I would call them sub-disciplines without this big discipline. And these sub-disciplines, they're called turuq, or that's a plural word for tariq, which means a way or a path. And there are so many paths that were established by some righteous scholars, by some righteous sages throughout centuries, um, and followers, Muslim followers, they followed those paths. And what kind of paths were those? So pretty much they mentioned to their followers to say, for example, La ilaha illallah. It is recommended in Islam, but they even put a number for those, and they say this is good, because we have seen a lot of blessings by mentioning this many times. Or maybe there is a anyways, there are other things that are not necessarily, as I said, commanded to be performed, but for these Sufi masters, they have seen spiritual elevations by performing them. Therefore, they are recommending, and they are, not just recommending, but they are encouraging, their followers to follow. So, for example, you have the Tariqa Naqshbandiya, which is very famous, mainly in Turkey, um, and in some other Arab countries and European majority Muslim countries. There are other tariqas, there are other orders, if we may call them, like for example Rifa'i or the Qadiris or Shazilis. These are very famous in the Arab countries, and particularly the Qadiris and Shazilis. You have in Africa, for example, Qadiri is very well known, and also Tijaniya. It's another order, and you have Muridiya and many others. So the list goes on and on, but I will close it right here. I'll close it right here, inshallah. As I see my daughter is coming also close here. We don't want to uh, get any further with this. She's very little, so hopefully it's not going to be a distraction, inshallah. But if there is any question or any comment that you have, I'll be more than happy to answer, inshallah. And thank you so much for listening to this. All right, so let's get to the questions here. We have one question here. How can I get any of the books? Let me see here. Please go. Source myself any guidance. Allah bless you, inshallah. This comes from our sister Noelia. She's from Mexico. I salute you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Noelia. These books, most of these books that I told you, you will be able to find them on PDF version online. Not all of them, but I believe most of them. Some of them you just have to order them mainly from Amazon or any other website that carries them. And once I come and visit the center there in Hermosillo, I'll be sitting more closely, inshallah, with you and perhaps your family too, and go over some details whenever God gives us a chance, to get away from here and come and visit you over there. All right. So Sister Azza is saying that there are 3 questions. Are there any audio books on an introduction to Sufism? I'm not aware of any of the books. I never came across books that are in audio, but somebody may search and find. The second one is, I have met Sufis in America who are not Muslim. Please explain. Well, Sufism is definitely very attractive because everybody wants to be lifted spiritually and wants to follow those individuals who are at peace and they have achieved certain levels of spirituality. There's no doubt in that. Um, However, as I said, for somebody to really have an effective um uh, fulfillment of these rituals, or an effective practice of tasawwuf, that person must be a Muslim, and in order to gain blessings, and in order for those practices to be beneficial to that person. But we're not saying that if a person who is not a Muslim performs such actions, that person has no benefits at all. Absolutely. I mean, there will definitely be benefits, but I'm saying to really have a lot of benefits and to enjoy some blessings through teachings of Islam. I think Islam is the key there, is behind those practices. Um, yeah, there are so many of them who do practice. And by the way, there are some famous Sufi, and I should mention this name, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, who is very well known throughout the world, and in particularly here in America. And he became the poet of the 21st century and perhaps 20th century to here in America. The most famous poet in America. You would think that would be somebody from America or maybe from Europe or somebody who talked about um, things that people usually talk about on daily basis and not necessarily Sufism or mysticism, but people are spiritual and people love spirituality. Therefore, he became the most celebrated poet of this century in America. Let's go to question number 3. Can anyone host a uh, remembrance? Let me try to get this screen going here. One second. Can anyone host a remembrance of dhikr, or is there a protocol one follows to do that? Also, please describe a dhikr circle. Yes, anybody can perform these Sufi practices by simply reading from the books or by following guidance of some shuyukhs, some of these masters, or some of these who understand Sufism very good. They can follow their advice, and even if they just simply follow the hadith of Prophet Muhammad from the hadith books too, they would be good in doing that as well. Um, but being in the company of a sheikh, for example, that is very important because you have a person who would be able to um, guide you better through the ethics and through the advice that the person may give you, and through also, checking on your inner spirituality, just like a doctor who would check you physically. This mentor too would check you spiritually. We're not saying that he's God to know all the details of your spirituality, but um, we'll have access to a certain point where he's going to or she's going to definitely help you a lot, improve yourself spiritually. So circles. So like I said, whether you have a person or you don't have a person, you will still benefit as long as you do some of these practices. But as I said, if you have a person who is really helping you, that's going to be like a super boost, that will make you, instead of going a long way, will cut the way short and perhaps lead you to the right place. And not all the mentors are going to be the same. Not all of them are going to definitely be sincere individuals. In my experience, I have come across strange people, weird ones, and I came across some of these scholars who were, um, these were so righteous and so inspired that we've seen miracles. And we have seen miracles and witnessed, experienced miracles from, those who even passed away simply by visiting their graveyards. That is the impact that they still have on individuals, even though they passed away. So um, sometimes people, they don't have that luxury to find these qualified people, but like I said, they can do it on their own. Some of these practices. Sufi circles would be important, but not all the Sufi circles will accept people into the circle. I mean, people, they will come and they will be outside the circle, witnessing, seeing, so getting a feeling of that experience, but not necessarily be a part of the circle. Again, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them are very particular. For example, Naqshbandis, they would not allow, and there are different Naqshbandis for sure, But a majority of the Naqshbandis, they would not allow other people to join a gathering. They consider it a very sacred time, um, and it's important that they don't have the public pretty much watching them and recording them and all that kind of stuff. Not that they're doing something weird or something bad, but it's just they tend to keep it very private. So you will see a lot of these circles of dhikr remaining private like that. But some are open, so people they can go, they can experience, and usually a person who's interested to enter that order, whatever order may be, whether it's Naqshbandi or Qadiri or Shazili or Rifa'i or whatever it is, the person may be initiated into the tariqah, and then that person will have better way of understanding those circles and really benefiting from the practices that take place in those circles. Okay, so I believe those were all the questions we had for tonight. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you, Sir Azra, for putting this together. Thank you, Brother Joseph, for uh, doing the logistics of this program tonight. May God bless every single one of you and increase you in spirituality and make you one of the best. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.
Thank you, Mufti Faya, and thank you to all who were able to join us this evening. ISBA is a non-profit organization and depends on financial support from the community. Please help us bring more programs like the one you experienced tonight by donating generously to ISBA. Our next Ilm Circles workshop will be on Tuesday, November the 17th, 2020, and the topic is The Place of Miracles in Judaism through the holiday of Hanukkah. It'll be presented by Rabbi John Linder right here, live on Facebook and YouTube. Until then, stay safe and healthy. Good evening.